A moving scrum of cameramen, policemen and the more mobile spectators, but Mr Callaghan did speak to many people, including one young constituent who actually got him to contemplate failure by asking him what he'd do if Labour didn't win the election.
I think I would be probably writing, you know? Yes.
What book?
Not children's books, I don't think.
So we've got Mrs Thatcher. Mrs Thatcher.
Mr Callaghan spent much of the day visiting industrial sites, and at West Wales Colliery he went to meet men as they came to the surface at the end of their shift. He talked to them and to coal board officials and union leaders about their jobs and the future of the industry. At first hand, submitting, like everyone else, to the obligatory search for cigarettes and matches. He then travelled...
No! That man Branston pickle! Throw that man up! Throw that man up!
Mr Callaghan was given a half-gallon jar of the factory's most famous product.
The biggest one I ever had.
The way Mr Callaghan felt as he advanced down the welcoming line of village beauties of Mogri in Gujarat, the home state of Moraji Desai. He'd come not only to receive the most charming hospitality of his tour, but to inspect one of the Indian Prime Minister's favourite schemes. Why future British aid may be given a somewhat more flexible character, even though Britain itself badly needs trade to...
One of the issues raised was the miners' demand for retirement at 60, something to which the Prime Minister is sympathetic.
I think everybody ought to be sympathetic with that. It's got to come within the pay rules, and therefore it couldn't come immediately, but I've no doubt myself that this country ought to work towards a time when miners can expect, certainly underground miners, that's all got to be negotiated, ought not to be expected to go underground for all their adult lives.
They're talking fairly tough about getting this retirement age by January.
The miners talk tough, and they are tough, but they're also reasonable, and they know what can be done and what can't be done.
Later, Mr Callaghan, who's over 60 himself, went to look at mining conditions more than a mile underground to see the progress on Wales's newest mine, which will begin full production in 1978. Tomorrow, though, the Prime Minister will be back on the more familiar territory of a political platform in West Wales, where he'll be making a major speech at a Labour rally.
First stop was Dockland, where the Port of London Authority showed Mr Callaghan some of its newer dock developments, though at times he had difficulty seeing the cranes for all the cameramen and officials. Next port of call, a food factory where each week they turn out 2 million jars and bottles of pickles and sauce. For the Prime Minister, it meant a quick change of hat. He was asked if this was where they made Mr Wilson's favourite sauce. After his visit, the Prime Minister gave his reaction to what he'd seen and heard during his visit to the East End.
Well, the spirit of the East Ender is as high as ever, that he feels that he needs some lift and some encouragement because he wants a decent environment to live in, and he wants good transport. All these are important things, and the Greater London Council and others are doing their best with limited resources.
Then it was back into the executive diner to continue the tour, one of a series he's making to local industry.
Like all visitors to the oil fields, the Prime Minister had to wear a survival suit and life jacket for his helicopter flight offshore. It's the first time Mr Callaghan has had a close look at the industry on which much of his future economic strategy depends. Forties is one of the world's largest oil fields, producing over £3 million worth of oil every day. By the end of the year, it should be providing more than a quarter of Britain's oil needs by itself. Mr Callaghan queued with some of BP's 400 offshore workers for his steak lunch. And later he watched a blowout firefighting demonstration by the BP fireship Forties Kiwi. After his visit, Mr Callaghan said North Sea oil must be used to regenerate British industry. He called for a public debate on how this could be done.
On the 7th day of an exhausting trip, it's not easy to look delighted if you're not. But there was no doubt. For Mogri and 900 other villages in this district have been showing how the milk yield of India's sacred animal, the cow, and its relative, the buffalo, can emerge from the disgrace of being the lowest in the world. India's average milk yield per animal is now only a 20th of, say, Denmark's. But this area is 10 times better than that average. The milk sells through a cooperative. Its 600 small farmers are paid daily according to the milk's fat content. They're encouraged towards better breeding of their stock and better feeding. The cooperative surplus is used to improve village facilities, including a TV set for educational programs. The farmers are never lacking for advice, including some from the Sussex farmer who, for 20 minutes, was their guest this week. Mr. Callaghan did hear one sour note sounded, though. The scientists and administrators who are trying to persuade all of India's milk farmers to do as well as these have been offered British aid to buy a computer for servicing a national milk grid and more aid to build a factory for making foot and mouth disease vaccine. But they complain they're treated with unreasonable toughness by British suppliers taking advantage of the fact that British aid can only be spent with British firms and not with their world competitors. It's a grumble Mr. Callaghan's heard before on this trip, and it's one reason flow from its aid handouts.